Anicca, dukkha, anatta. The Buddha said, Sabe sankara anicca, sabe sankara dukkha, sabe sankara anatta. So this was in Pali, and the translation goes, all conditioned things are impermanent. All conditioned things are unsatisfactory. All conditioned things have no self. So those are called the three marks of existence. Anicca, dukkha, anatta. We'll talk about anicca today. And then in subsequent talks, we'll talk about dukkha and we'll talk about anatta after that. But this has been something that's been my viewpoint or my focal point about how to approach Buddhism, how to approach the Dharma. There's so many lists out there, so many concepts, but it turns out by looking at these three concepts, I was able to understand and enter into the doorway of Buddhism in a much more structured way that kind of made sense to me. And so as I've been going into that exploration, I'm trying to see if I can make that part of the teaching and bring you all along into that too. So these concepts, let's take this first concept. All conditioned things are impermanent. Right? What is a conditioned thing? What do we mean by impermanent? And so these are some of the questions that might start coming up to you. But what's interesting is, before we kind of go into some of these concepts over here, we'll start with a little bit of historic context. We'll talk about, maybe what the words mean themselves, how what we did in meditation, how that related to what we were doing right now. And then we'll take some examples of different kinds of conditioning and kind of walk through that a little bit. So it turns out the Buddha, 2,600 years ago, really kind of came upon these concepts: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, non-self. And they called it the three characteristics of existence, trilakshana, the three marks of existence. I tend to use some Pali words, and then I tend to translate them into Sanskrit sometimes because you get to understand the words a little bit more. And some of these concepts, it turns out the Buddha came up with 2,600 years ago, and he talked about it in his first two sermons. So soon after he got enlightenment, there was one sermon that was called Dharma Chakra Pravartana Sutta. And on your way out, you can see the little painting in the back of the room where the Buddha is talking to 5 disciples there. That was his first sermon. And then in the second sermon, it was called the Anatta Lakshana Sutta. He talked a little bit more about these main concepts. So these main concepts of anicca, dukkha, and anatta were things that the Buddha came up with and talked about in the first 2 sermons. But why 3? Why not 4? Why not 5? Right? And was there some historical context which influenced the Buddha to talk about these 3 characteristics of existence? So it turns out, well, Buddhism grew up in kind of the northeastern part of India. And there was a civilization that existed there before Buddhism. And this was the Hinduism, Vedic religion. Right? And there were the Vedas, and there was this whole concept of philosophy behind that. And that happened, the characterization of that happened probably about 3,500 years ago. And the Hindus, with the Vedic philosophy, they came up with a concept that they called Sachidananda. They said, what is existence? And their answer was Sachidananda. And that is a compound word consisting of three parts. Sat, Chit, Ananda. And their philosophy said existence, human existence, is Sat, always. Chitta, consciousness. Ananda, happy. There is a soul or a consciousness that exists forever and that is happy, was the Hindu philosophy. So they came up with this three marks of existence according to their principles. Now, the Buddha spent years learning about what was happening in this context. He learned about Hinduism, he learned about meditation, he learned about the jhanas. And after he got enlightenment, he said, you know, I think they're slightly different. Where people talk about Sat, always, I actually think it's anicca, it's impermanent. When they say consciousness, self, he said, well, I'm not sure that's what's happening. I think it's actually not self, anatta. And ananda, there's possibility of happiness forever. He said, you know, I think it's actually unsatisfactoriness. So the Buddha was a radical. This was thousands of years of existing philosophy and culture. And the Buddha said, you know, I think it's actually different. So that's what's kind of interesting about this practice that survived for 2,600 years. And he was bucking the trend even then. So let's go into the words a little bit. Etymology. Words can mean a lot of interesting things, right? So we'll come back to Sabbe, Sankhara, Anicca. Sankhara, all conditioned things are impermanent. A conditioned thing, mental formation, that's what a sankhara is supposed to be. Now, the Pali language is people don't speak Pali anymore. It's only there in the Buddhist philosophies. But then Sanskrit, which was, a different form of Pali, if you will. It was kind of the more classical version of Pali. That still exists in some ways, and there's dictionaries around that. So it's interesting to go back and look at those words a little bit more. So sankhara, the Sanskrit word is called samskara, samskara. So I just went in and looked at the dictionary and said, well, what is samskara? What is samskara in Sanskrit? Well, it turns out it's talking about deep behavioral patterns. Right? So what are some of the words that were used there? Mental impressions, psychological imprints, behavioral patterns. So when you're going to go and look at that, that gives you a better sense of what a sankhara might be. Conditioning. We all go through conditioning. That conditioning is what is called sankhara, samskara. Right? And that kind of helps you get a better understanding of what a sankhara is compared to the traditional, it's a mental formation. What's a mental formation? I don't know what a mental formation is, right? So that's a traditional translation from Pali. So conditioned things are samskaras. So that's interesting. What about anicca? Anicca. Anicca is impermanent. Now, if you translate that to Sanskrit, the Sanskrit word for that is anitya. Anitya. And anitya is a compound word, na nitya. Nitya means always or permanent. Na nitya is not permanent, not always. Right? So we have this very nice translation. It's not a magic chant. There is no magic in this. It says, deep psychological imprints are not permanent. It sounds so simple, but it can be very profound. Think of all of the psychological imprints that you have. Think of all of the conditioning that you have. Decades of conditioning, decades of deep behavioral imprints. What if all of those are impermanent? That can be very profound. But what's interesting about a lot of these teachings is that there's three ways you can learn about them. Right? You can hear about them, like you're doing right now. You can think about them yourself intellectually. Is this true? Does that make sense? That's the second way of thinking about them. And then the third way of thinking about them is, can you personally experience them yourself? And that's how you really know about a concept. You can hear about it, you can think about it, and you can experience it. So we actually experienced impermanence during our meditation and during Jim's Qigong. As we are being aware of sensations, we started the breath, arising, passing away, arising, passing away. Sensations in the body, arising, passing away. These are impermanent. So these are some of the impermanent things we're looking at. So words can be very interesting, right? So it gives you some etymology, it gives you some history behind how to think about these things. But when we're talking about our meditation, we went a little deeper. We talked about arising and passing away. We talked about the sensations. But we also talked about, was there a sense of liking and disliking? Liking and disliking. And why is that important? This is a concept that is called Vedana, and I think Paul's going to be talking about that a lot more end of the month. But it's translated to feeling tone, feeling tone. It's essentially when you have a sensation, is it liking, disliking, liking, disliking? And it turns out this is one of the key things that the Buddha found out about sensations and liking and disliking. These ultimately cause sankharas. Conditioning happens when you get sensory input from the outside world. Sensory input falls on your sense objects. You can hear something, you can smell something, you see something, you can taste something. You have bodily sensations. You have mental thoughts that come up. These are all sensations which come in contact with your sense organs. And the very first thing that happens is there's liking or disliking. And that happens in a non-cognitive way, even before you perceive what that object is, you like or dislike. And from then onwards, it gets into conditioning. So if we have an opportunity to observe and sit quietly and observe the arising and passing away, and if you can observe the liking and the disliking and say, what if I did not like or dislike? What if I said, I will try not to like or dislike. I will observe the sensation as a sensation, the breath as the breath. The tightness of the chest as the tightness of the chest. The pain in my thigh as a pain in the thigh, without liking or disliking. New sankharas stop forming. And as you sit in this calmness, old sankharas keep coming up in your meditation. Old conditioning comes up. And through this mindful practice, you stop new sankharas from forming. You're aware of the old sankharas, and you start getting more towards freedom. That was the profound awakening that the Buddha had. And it's available to all of us. This was not magic. This was not a secret. All it takes is for us to sit comfortably upright and sink into ourselves. Isn't that amazing? That's so profound. Now, I'm thinking whether we should get into our head or not, but maybe we will. Paul, can we bring up the PDF document? And we'll go to the first slide in that. So we're going to go into our head a little bit over here. And you're not going to be able to see this. So know that that's a concept. And what's on the top is a concept called the 5 aggregates of clinging. And some of you might have heard about it. It's called the skandhas or the khandhas. It starts with having physical form. And then there is the liking and disliking. There's perception. And then finally, there's going to be consciousness. We'll talk about that at a different time. That's a whole other talk there. At the bottom was another interesting concept that the Buddha came up with called the 12 steps of dependent origination. We don't have to go in there right now. But once again, it starts with physical form, goes into this liking and disliking, and then ends with consciousness. So these are all very heady concepts that we can get into. But it all starts with having that experience that we're having about sitting quietly in there. So you can get knowledge by hearing about something, by intellectually thinking about it. We can think about this at some point, and then experiencing it ourselves. Just know that there's a lot more for the thinking mind to go in and dig into if that's the kind of conditioning that you've been into. A lot of us have been conditioned based upon decades of schooling, having to be in a place where you have to think about facts and figures and documents. And if that's your conditioning, this may be interesting to you. But if it's not, that's okay. Because to know the truth, you can experience it always. So this was some of the historical context of impermanence and sankharas. Sankhara, sabe sankhara, anicca. But let's take some examples of different kinds of conditioning. Right? Some of the kinds of conditioning can be really deep, and you may not even think about them as conditioning, or you might not recognize that as conditioning. So here's one conditioning that was part of my process, and I didn't even know that was my conditioning until there was some sitting and some deeper practice in there. But let's go to the last slide, Paul. This last slide. So we're going to look at a picture. This comes from Indian mythology. So I grew up in India for 22 years before moving to the States. The next one. There. There's a lot of words in there, but let's ignore all the words. And let's look at the picture on the left side of the screen. On the left side of the screen, it says Rama. And then look at the picture that you're seeing there. There's 3 people there, most probably men. They're dressed in the mythology of India. There's 3, there's actually 4. But look at the colors of their skin. 2 of them are blue. They have blue-colored skin. 2 of the others have more what used to be called the old days with crayons as flesh tone, right? This was your pink and light brown. 2 of those people are light brown, 2 of them are blue. And these were comic books. These were comic books I grew up reading. These were comic books that a lot of children in India grew up reading. And so we were told that, and by the way, by looking at their stature, looking at how they're standing in there, how they're portrayed, you know they're good guys. They're good people, right? So the good people, the good guys, are either blue or they're light brown. This was part of my conditioning that was not apparent. Now let's look at some of the panels on the right side. It's a little harder to see, but then on the top right over there, you have this, once again, light-skinned person who's meditating and doing something spiritual. And then there are people who are coming in like creating havoc around them. What color is their skin? It's dark brown. In the middle panel there, there's, a light brown guy and a blue guy, and they're firing arrows at dark brown people. Same thing down below. What color is my skin? Dark brown. Am I a good guy? Am I a bad guy? Sankara. Conditioning. Right? So I was not even aware that there's conditioning happening in here. By the way, why do they portray, actually, let's go to the middle one. You're going to see a similar kind of things. This was Rama, a god in Indian mythology. This is Krishna. Krishna is also a god in the Indian mythology. And once again, on the left side, Krishna, the god, is blue. And when he's fighting the bad people are brown. Krishna, the actual word Krishna means dark brown skin. Krishna, the god, was a dark brown skin. But if they showed him with a dark brown skin, how do they show the bad people? So we'll color him blue. So the blue color was for dark brown skin people who were good. But the dark brown skin meant that, Nana, you were one of the demons. This is written down nowhere. There's actually a lot of philosophical conversations about why they're colored blue. Because the sky is blue. Because blue is a holy color. That may be true. But what is this conditioning that's coming into people? What is your conditioning? What social signals have you been getting that have conditioned you, that tell you that you're the other, right? That is the sankhara. That is the sankhara that's powerful. But it wasn't just comic books. There's all this other conditioning that comes in. Let's take a look at, this is an ad that used to come out in India again. And yeah, let's look at the ad. It's in Hindi. So you're not gonna, most of us will not be able to understand the words, but just look at the affect, and maybe we'll look at it a couple of times, and I'll give you the translation. There'll be some loud music and some words. The words may not make sense, but see if you can kind of observe what's happening in there.
एक और कॉफी देना।
दूध नहीं है, कॉफी। बेटी की कमाई यूं ही पीते जा रहे हो।
काश हमें एक बेटा होता।
कॉफी उनको देना। एयर होस्टेस।
बदल दे दुनिया आपकी नए फेयर एंड लवली का 4-स्टेप एक्शन। पहला सनस्क्रीन धूप से बचाए, दूसरा चिपचिपाहट घटाए, तीसरा चेहरे से दाग हटाए और चौथा भीतर से निखारे आपको।
बेटा, एक कॉफी मिलेगा?
चेहरे पे लिखे नई तकदीर, नया फेयर एंड लवली।
So even though we didn't understand the words, we saw what this was. So what did the words say? This was an ad for a skin whitening cream. And this was not too long ago, even though it looks much older. This was from 2010. And so it starts with a father and a husband and wife. And the father says, "Can I have some more coffee, please?" And the mother says, "We're out of milk. And we need the milk for our daughter who's coming back from work." And then they show the daughter coming back from work. And the father is frustrated because there's not enough milk in the coffee, for coffee. And he says, "I wish we had a son." See that in the ad. And the daughter comes in right at the time when the father says, "I wish we had a son." And she starts crying. And she said, "I don't want the coffee. Give it to him." And then it shows her going into her room crying. And then she says, "I'm not making enough money so that my father can have coffee. So I'm going to buy a skin whitening cream, apply to be an air hostess, make more money, and then I'll take them out to a nice restaurant and he can have his coffee." How's that for conditioning? There was some amount of uproar about this, but not a whole lot, because this was reflecting the conditioning of the society. So, what conditioning are you hearing every day? What do you think is something that is unchangeable about you? What do you think is you? What if that was also anicca? What if that was impermanent? How would that change how you would relate to yourself? How would it change how would you relate to others? Could that be a profound awakening for you? Let's give ourselves a minute to metabolize that information. Conditioning is all around us. New sankharas are being formed every day, minute by minute. Old sankharas are present. Some of these are intergenerational sankharas. But they are all anicca. They are all impermanent. A caveat over here. There may be physical conditions. You may have neurodivergence. You may have a physical condition. That is not conditioning. That is something that needs medical attention. So please do not think that just by meditation, medical conditions can be solved. You need to see a medical practitioner for some of those things in there. But conditioning, which is not a medical aspect, that you can look at through meditation, through mindfulness, by seeing things clearly. Sabbe sankhara anicca.